Timeline adaptation. The narrator frames a formative memory at 8 as the symbolic end of childhood. Factual events later in adolescence remain, as in the source. My childhood ended at 8, inside my own house. I say it like a fact, because that was how it lived inside me. A clean, bright fracture in the middle of a life that otherwise looked ordinary to anyone passing by. Not on a battlefield, not in a hospital, not with some sudden catastrophe in the street. It happened in the hush of our small kitchen, under the dim light of a single bulb, with the cast-iron stove breathing its long, slow warmth and the smell of boiled cabbage clinging to the curtains. My name is Adele. I am 71 now, and I carry that 8th year like a stone in my pocket, rounded at the edges, worn smooth by remembering and by not speaking it aloud for so long. When people ask how I learned to be careful, to keep my eyes wide for small changes in others, I tell them about that night because it contains everything that followed. The shaping of silence, the first lesson in reading grief, the pact I would later make without knowing its full shape. We lived in a house that was neither large nor particularly small. It sat modest and stubborn on the slope of our village, roof tiles uneven like the wrinkles on my mother's hands. The walls inside were the color of boiled linen, and the windows never quite shut out the cold. In winter, the stove was our oracle. You heated it in the morning, and it held the day's warmth like a patient animal. At night it hissed and crackled and made the shadows breathe. The lamp above the table threw a pool of yellow light that never reached the corners where moths circled like quiet questions. My mother, Sebastiana, worked with a dignity that had the kind of sharpness you feel against skin. It did not complain, but you could see where it cut her. She mended clothes at the market, ironed shirts for families richer than ours, and cleaned apartments in the town when the harvest was thin. Her hands were calloused in spokes. There was a rhythm to them that I learned to recognize as early as I learned the alphabet. She would sew by the light of that lamp, her head bent like a woman at prayer, and when she laughed, rarely like a bird lifting its head, you felt it was a small, brave defiance against some gravity pulling her under. We ate together at the same table most nights, though often in silence. Not the comfortable silence of a shared joke or a pause at ease, but a careful silence, elastic and taut, that knew how to avoid certain places. There were things we never named at dinner, words that hovered like flies and were brushed away, names of people who used to be our name, memories tied to other houses and better linens. I knew, even as a child, that some things were folded up and kept out of sight because they would tear the house if opened. When I say my childhood ended at 8, I mean that I woke to that knowledge in a way that made play and light seem suddenly thin and fragile. It was not that a single violent act occurred in front of me. Rather, one night I learned the language of adult sorrow in a way I could not unlearn. I remember how the lamp burned lower than usual. I remember the metallic taste of fear in my mouth, and the way the wooden floor made its own small music when I crept from my bed. I remember my mother's hands, those hands that fixed, that soothed, that counted my bread, wringing a handkerchief until the threads whispered against her knuckles. She was whispering too, a soft sound like prayer but not quite. She was saying I'm sorry in a voice I had never heard her use before, not for a small thing like a burnt saucepan, but as if apologizing to someone bigger, someone absent. There are images that anchor themselves to a soul. For me it was the photograph in the tin box. I found it later enough that the discovery itself became a story. But the memory of that lamp-lit night and the picture from the tin are braided in my mind. In the photo she was younger than I am now, hair pinned, a dress too bright for a woman who would later iron the creases out of other people's garments for a living. She stood next to a man I did not know then, his posture stiff, his face like a coin you couldn't quite make out in the light. I would learn the name Vittorio much later. For a long time, the photograph was only that, a perfect square of someone else's past. At 8, I learned how to be quiet, not from fear of a slap or a raised voice. There was little of that in our home, but from the lesson that questions did not always make things better. If I asked who was in the photograph, my mother would look away, and when she did, I saw the shadows under her eyes deepen. She would tell me small truths instead. Yes, of course we will make you a proper shirt for First Communion. Of course you can have the blue ribbon next to your books. She taught me to fold sorrow into the tasks at hand, to stitch, to sweep, to iron, to go to school with clean hands. The practical world became an armor. School was a place of edges. I loved the smell of chalk, the way letters unfolded under my pencil. I loved the geometry of maps, and the way a poem could make winter feel like something less cold. For a while I thought books might be the way out, a gentle cord I could use to pull myself somewhere else. But school was also the place where the world measured us. People with better shoes were afforded time to be reckless. People like us were given the lesson early. Time is a thing you pay back with work, not with wandering. My days after 8 were a strange palimpsest of childhood and duty. I still climbed the fig tree behind the house when the fruit was ripe. I still collected snails in the spring and fed them crumbs. I still drew houses with chimneys in my notebooks, and imagined ours taller, with curtains that did not sag. Yet beneath those small joys, there was the steady pressure of responsibility. By 11, I had a basket of mending slung over my arm. By 14, I was earning small coins that meant winter boots and sometimes a slice of cake at the festival. When people ask whether my mother was proud, I never answer with a simple yes. She was proud in the way a woman trims a hedge, with efficiency and no grand speeches. She was proud because she refused to speak badly of anyone, even those who had looked away when she needed a hand. She would go to church and sit in the back and make the sign of the cross, as if to tuck herself into a corner where no one could unnerve her. And yet there was an unspoken weight in her pride. It was like a garment 2 sizes too small, fitting enough to hold you upright but tight in the shoulders. Our village was a place that liked stories tidy. It preferred a good marriage, a clear lineage, a house with laundry on the line, and a church bell on Sunday. Shame, when it visited, had a way of making itself loud in the market square. People would not speak directly about another's sorrow, but their silence around you would be a crowd all the same. They would avert their eyes when they remembered a name, or speak quickly about other things when you passed by, the conversation folding over itself like a seam. I learned early how to read a room. I could tell by the set of someone's shoulders whether they knew something and chose not to say it. I could tell by the way an older woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth that gossip had lit its spark. Those small cues taught me caution, and caution taught me self-protection. There are many ways to become an adult. Mine was by subtraction. Play was not taken away from me by force. It slipped away quietly, like the small coins from a child's palm. It would be an oversimplification to imagine our life as only quiet grief. There were intervals of sun. My mother taught me how to roll dough until it sang under the palms of your hands, and the sight of dough rising in a warm kitchen was like the promise of something good. She had a laugh she let out sometimes when the butter came out just right, or when a neighbor's child recited a poem incorrectly, and we both had to hide our smiles. There were nights of music at the festival, and I remember dancing with a cousin under paper lanterns that made the world look as if it were stitched with gold thread. When Franco arrived in my life, he did so like someone opening a window in a room that had been shut for a long time. He smelled of the river and sawdust, and he carried the sort of steadiness that felt like a shore after years at sea. We met at the mill of all places. I was there to deliver a basket of clothes, and he was there to fix a broken cart. He had hands that knew the grain of wood, and when he spoke about how a plank holds together, you could tell he thought about things carefully. He was not loud. He was not showy. He listened the way my mother once had, attentively, as if everything you said had weight. Our courtship was slow. We passed notes like schoolchildren and complained to each other about the weather. He asked my mother for permission in a way that made her blink and look as if the world had folded back into something sensible. He asked for my hand, with a nervousness that made me laugh and then cry, because it felt like being given a ladder when you had only known to climb trees. We were married under a small sky, the sun pressed between the parishes, with neighbors pressing a few coins into our palms, and the priest offering a blessing that tasted of bread and incense. After we married, we made a home the way two people build a camp, from what they can find, with pragmatic tenderness. Franco found work in the town building small furniture, and I did mending and took in a little extra ironing. For the first time since that lamp-lit night, my life felt like a house, with windows that actually opened. We laughed more than I had thought possible. Our apartment smelled of lemon oil and sawdust, and we learned to share a bed the way we learned to share a broom, without fuss, but with care. My mother lived with us for a while after the wedding. It was one of the few things that made me feel as if the broken threads of our family might be stitched anew. She kept one corner of the kitchen as if it were sacred, a kettle that always had something warming it, a small tin where she kept tea. In the mornings, she would rise early and make coffee and fold my shirts like a blessing. She would sit by the window and mend a sock and talk to the neighbors over the fence in the way people do when they want to remind the world they still belong somewhere. Her presence was a quiet gift, and I was careful with it. I did not ask for the photograph in the tin. She carried her secrets like a shawl, draped, inevitable, and warm against the chill. She would sometimes sit with her hands folded and stare at something I could not see, and I learned again to look away, to let other people's silence be theirs. But living together also meant that the old shadows could walk into our new sun. There were evenings when the past knocked like rain at the window, and I would watch my mother press her hand to her chest, as if to hold something in. There was a party in the village the summer after we married, a celebration of harvest and old friendships. People came from neighboring towns. The square was full of music and chatter, the smell of fried dough and roasted meat. We wore our good clothes, Franco in his jacket with a torn sleeve mended so well you could not see the repair, and I in the dress my mother had ironed until it shone like a quiet claim. My mother had a small handbag and a scarf pinned at the throat. For a while, the three of us walked together in an easy parade, the old rhythm resuming itself like a song found again. Then something happened that would stay with me for years. It was as small as a single candle blown by a breath, and as large as a sky collapsing. A man passed the square, older, oddly familiar to me though I could not yet put the face to a name, and in the pause as he walked by, something in my mother's face altered. Her mouth tightened, not with anger, but as if she had swallowed a stone. Her hands began to tremble. She turned away as if to catch herself on the market stall, and for a moment she was a little girl flushed with something heavy. She left the square. She told us she would sit by the church and wait. That night, after everyone had returned and the lanterns had been taken down, she came into the kitchen looking as if she had aged another year. She sat at the table and placed both hands flat as if to keep herself steady. "I cannot do those places any more," she said, not looking up. Her voice was worn thin. "There are faces that bring me back. I did not know then what 'bring me back' meant exactly. I only knew the pattern, the lamp, the wrung handkerchief, the photograph in the tin. I could feel the old fracture shift under my skin, as if a seam in a dress had caught and pulled. That night I realized in a way that had a sharpness to it, the world would sometimes produce people like weather, cold fronts you could not prepare for, and you had to shelter however you could. It was after that party that my mother finally told me a fragment of the truth. Not the whole story. She never divulged everything, and she guarded what she kept with a careful cruelty that was at once protective and absolute. She told me about a time when she had a different name at table, and she said the name like you name an illness. It was something from long ago that needed to be acknowledged and then kept at a distance. She told me of a man who had been near her once. She spoke of his hands and how they had been polite once and unfamiliar later. She said that she had been given a life that was not hers, like a coat that never fit, and that she had chosen, in the end, to leave that coat and live in what small dignity she could make on her own. I listened. I did not ask for more. There was sleep in me that was fragile after that night, and I learned that secrets did not necessarily become less heavy by being unearthed. Sometimes their revelation only rearranged the weight. Before I go further, I must say this. My promise to my mother was not a vow forged in defiance or in cowardice. It was the choice of a child who had learned early the cost of noise. She asked me with no flourish to keep her past as a private thing. She said simply, "Don't go looking. Promise me." There was a kind of scared humility in it. It was not a secret kept to hide shame alone. It was a shield for the tiny life she had crafted with thread and thrift and quiet courage. I promised. That promise would years later shape how I acted at a meeting of faces where a man had his own comfortable life and, without knowing it, the trace of something he had set down. Life after that folded itself into the normal cadence of working and saving and making a home. Franco and I had our first child not long after. We named her Clara because the word felt like sunlight. When she came, the house filled with a noise I had not known before. A busy, clumsy symphony of nappies and lullabies, of tiny toes, and a cry that was always true and immediate. My mother softened around Clara. She would sit in the corner and watch her as if looking at a miracle she had no right to touch. It was as if seeing us build this small, ordinary joy healed something tender and old in her. But the past waits like tide. It does not understand domestic peace. There were evenings when my mother would go to the window and watch the road as if expecting someone to come. Sometimes she would fold and unfold a letter she had tucked away, and I would see the intensity with which she looked at nothing and know she was bargaining with a memory. I asked her once, years later, if she regretted keeping silent. She looked at me the way a woman measures an onion before cutting, careful, patient, and said, "There are some houses you enter to leave hot. I chose the one that kept us warm." I would not say that I stopped wanting to know, or that curiosity never nudged me. It did. But the promise I made at 8 and the compassion I felt toward her made silence feel sometimes like mercy. In a way that may seem strange, I believe that my mother's small acts of bravery, earning, feeding, preserving, were a better legacy than dragging old names into light. Still, secrets have a way of showing themselves. They do not always announce their presence. Often they arrive as a tremor. There was a small moment, years later, when the world presented me with the man from the photograph. It was at a charity event in the town. They had a dinner and auctions to raise money for the school, and people who were seen as pillars came out of their carved houses to be applauded. I was there because Franco had built a small chest that they were displaying. He stood by it, humility in hands, and I watched him with a pride that warmed me like bread. And then he was there, Vittorio, older, steadier, and with that posture like a coin. I recognized a face I had seen before, the way you recognize a scent from a long-closed cupboard. My mouth went dry. I felt the old seam pull under my ribs. For a moment I wondered what a life could be, If two people could pass each other in a crowded room and not know their histories. But histories are stubborn. They collect like dust, and they move in the breath of a room until someone sniffs them and remembers. I did not act right away. I watched him as one watches a ship pass in fog, curious, distant. He did not look at me. Perhaps he did not know my face or did not remember it. He looked like a man who had lived a life without looking back. There was a small audience around him, people who greeted him as if he were a good piece of weather. I could have kept the promise then. I could have let the dinner pass and taken home the warmth of Franco's little victory and the applause for his chest. But secrets, especially the ones we carry in our bones, have a way of insisting on their hour. The scene is not grand. There is no opera in this memory, only a small table, a glass that sweated with wine, and a priest who made a speech about charity. I moved through the room with my hands trembling only slightly, and found myself in front of him. I said something simple, his name, which tasted strange on my tongue, like a word dredged from the deep. He turned and looked at me the way someone looks at a photo that suddenly redeems itself. A blink, a quick arithmetic of recognition, and then the shutter closing again. What he said to me was not an accusation nor an embrace. It was a measurement. He asked me, calm and clinical, if I knew where my mother was. It was the sort of question one asks when trying to confirm the shape of a map. There was no apology wrapped in it, no offering. Just an inquiry with the politeness of a man who had always had doors open to him. I felt anger then, but not the kind that makes noise. It was a quiet, ancient anger, like the one that wills a tree to root deeper in wind. I thought of my mother's folded hand at the window, of her hands mending my small shirts and holding Clara beneath the blanket. I thought of the promise I had made in the dim light of home, the vow to shelter the life my mother had made from whatever storms her past might bring. And so I spoke, but I spoke in a way that sought not vengeance, but restoration. I know where she is, I said. I know the work she does. I know the life she has carved with her hands. What we have here is her life now. There are moments where words are the right shape. My speech that night was not composed to wound. It was a ledger, small and precise, of the cost of absence. The people around us fell into a hush that was not the kind of silence I knew from childhood. This was a silence that had contours, an audience listening to a reckoning. The man who called himself Vittorio did not offer a scene. He put a hand to his mouth and then left, as if there were nothing in his life that required him to return. I will tell you now that what I wanted was not to humiliate him. I had no appetite for theatrics. What I wanted was to say plainly what he had had and what he had lost, to mark the record of our ordinary, stubborn dignity. When you raise a child, you do so with little ceremonies, tufts of haircut, first steps applauded, scraped knees attended with sugar and water. If a man then appeared in your life who had not kept his end of some silent bargain, it was not the revenge you sought, but the recognition of what had been taken and what had been made again. After that dinner, things shifted. People looked at my mother differently, as if a veil had been lifted. Some faces softened, some drew back. My mother, who had carried shame like a cloak, put it aside and wore instead a small, grave pride. She did not run into the arms of the past to demand what she might have lost. She collected the pieces she had made herself and arranged them on the table like a fresh set of plates. But that day did not close the circle. It opened it. It revealed how fragile the boundaries of privacy and public memory could be, and how a promise made in the dim of a kitchen can have consequences you cannot fully foresee. It taught me that adulthood is often a series of small reckonings disguised as ordinary events. A party, a dinner, a man passing through a square. The world will give you opportunities to speak, and sometimes the moment arrives to use the voice you have learned in silence. I tell you all of this not to make a simple moral of pain and triumph. Life is not a fable with clean endings. What I want you to see is the slow geometry of a life. How one small broken place shapes the whole house. How a stove and a lamp can hold both memory and warmth. How a promise to protect can lead to decisions that are both tender and hard. My childhood ended at 8 because I learned in a single quiet night that some things are kept and some things are spoken of with care. From there, I built my life, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with fierce joy. I learned to press my own hands into the work of repair. There are others who will tell you that silence is a kind of cowardice. I will not disagree entirely. Silence can be cowardice when it allows injustice to continue, but silence can also be a form of protection, the only tool available to a woman whose world had been narrowed by choices made for her. There is no easy lesson here, only the complicated truth that love requires both speech and discretion, and that dignity can be preserved in many shapes. In the years that followed, Franco and I raised our children the best we could. We argued, we made mistakes, we learned how to make soup from scraps, we joined church suppers and lent each other tools. The kitchen in our house was loud with children and with laughter that sometimes made me dizzy because it seemed to undo the years of quiet that preceded it. My mother lived to see grandchildren at our table. She learned to play cards again and to tell a story with a beginning and an end rather than with ellipses. But she also kept certain evenings for herself, times when she would go out with a basket and come back with a parcel of bread and unknown flowers. She kept a space in her life that was not ours to invade, and perhaps that is what she wanted most, a life that could not be judged by the village's ledger. I want to be honest about the weight that still folded into me when the man called Vittorio walked by. It was not a dramatic public flogging. I did not seek to shame him with a banner. What I did was something quieter. I named our survival in a room full of people who would afterward recall that there had been another possible story. That small act of naming, gentle and unadorned, allowed me to hold my head a little higher when I returned to the stove and the lamp and to the children's laughter. There is more to tell. There are nights in the convent where refuge was built of simple bread and the steady kindness of women with slow voices. There are the years of work that taught me the mathematics of poverty and thrift. There are the private arguments Franco and I had about whether to tell a child the truth or leave a history wrapped in silence. There are also the small miracles that have nothing to do with angels, like the first time my granddaughter asked to wear her blue ribbon, and the way my mother clapped like a child who had finally, at last, been allowed to speak. But tonight, as I remember and as I speak to you, I return again to that lamp-lit kitchen and to the 8-year-old who learned a new language of sorrow. I carry her like a companion who taught me to be careful with other people's hearts. I am not proud of every silence I kept, nor do I regret every protection I offered. Life demanded choices, and we made them with the imperfect courage that grief affords. Something shifted the night I stood before Vittorio at that dinner and spoke. It was not a judgment as much as a ledger balanced. People who had known us began to look at us with new eyes. Some softened and made room, others recoiled. But the house I had built with Franco and the small chorus of our family held. My mother, who had stood at its center like a quiet pillar, found a place where she could breathe without the fear of being measured only by the poverty of her past. The story does not end there. There was exile and refuge, and a child born within the walls of a place that smelled of wax and starch. There was a promise sworn between two women in a small room with thin curtains. There were choices that would test our bonds and the quiet courage that would hold us through long winters. These things deserve the slow and patient telling they require. For now, I leave you with the image that began it all, the lamp that threw its small circle of light across the table, the stove that kept its slow breath, and the hands of a woman ironing my life into shape. If honest stories matter, subscribe. There are nights in the convent I can still walk into as if the door were open. The air there smelled of starch and boiled linen and something that was almost like safety. An ordered safety, the kind you could fold and place in a cupboard. The nuns kept time with the hush of footsteps and the bell that marked meals and prayer. I remember the way the light fell through high, frosted panes in thin, bright bands. It made dust look like a small congregation of saints. It is strange now to find such tenderness in a place that in our village had the reputation of stern rules and cropped hair. For my mother, it was less a place of judgment than a shelter with hands. Don Alessio was the one who first nudged the door open. He had a parish that smelled of wax and old hymnals, and he moved through it with a kind of practical kindness. Never grand, always present. He had seen my mother in church, sitting near the back, fingers worrying a rosary she never finished. When the story had reached his ears, he had not asked for drama or proof. He had simply offered options. "We will see you through," he said to my mother, with that steadiness that came from being a man whose life was spent in small acts of tending. Mother Carla, the superior at the convent, was a woman whose voice could both cut and comfort. She had the way of speaking to a person as if they were a bridge in need of repair, direct, with the promise of tools. She did not moralize about past choices. She assessed what was needed to keep two lives, my mother's and the child's, safe. In the narrow rooms of the convent they kept a registry of kindness, the way other institutions kept accounts. Food was lent, a bed offered, anonymity preserved. My mother always said later that Madre Carla had the look of someone who had been given bread and then asked to share it with dignity, not pity. When the decision to go to the convent was made, there was no fanfare. My mother packed a small trunk with more care than drama, a dress that had once been bright, a tin with letters folded like small envelopes of heat, the photograph that had come to be a burden and a relic all at once. She pressed the trunk closed as if sealing a promise, and looked at me, then not yet old enough to understand all the meanings of a suitcase, and said softly, "We will be back to the light." She meant simply that they would give us a daylight of kindness until a harder world shifted. The convent taught my mother a different morality of survival, one carved not by noise, but by routines. It was there she learned to let the world spin without the constant worry of being watched. It was there that she learned that to care for a child could be to keep that child safe in invisibility, until invisibility could be traded for a life. Those months were not idyllic. They were filled with waiting and the peculiar burn of keeping oneself small so that no one might take what little you had left. But the nuns fed us and wrapped the baby, me, in linen, and when I was too small to name suffering, I learned the smell of bread and the sound of a hymn as lullabies. There are things that become private legends in a family. Mine was that the nuns taught my mother a laundry of rituals for keeping a secret. They advised on how to register a birth under a different parish for a time, how to weave a child into the fabric of a household without asking for explanations that might draw suspicion. They taught my mother to write letters that looked like ordinary correspondence, to accept as small miracles the kindness of other women who would not ask why a quiet woman needed more bread. As long as our name could be preserved from gossip, the wider world would not tilt the table of our lives. When I was old enough to understand my shape in the world, my mother told me in fragments about how I came to be. She spoke of nights of fear that she would rather blot from her memory. She spoke of the choice to keep me and to hide us both from a past that could beat heavy on a thin roof. She did not tell me juicy particulars. She gave me instead a steady narrative of survival. "You were my heart," she said. "You are the place I made by holding on." Those words were enough. They were a map and a promise of shelter. She never spoke my father's name aloud in the house. It lived in the photograph, in the way she sometimes let her gaze rest on a face turned down or away. The photograph was both a map and a ruin. It pointed to a place she would not walk back to. Convent life left its traces on me too. When I think of small comforts, I remember the sisters who taught me to peel apples the long way, the woman who showed me how to darn socks until they looked less like repairs and more like designs. I learned in that place how the hands of women could be an economy, currencies of tenderness and labor. The nuns gave me an early school of work, stitching, sweeping, the soft mathematics of measuring cloth. It was a childhood not in the sun but in the competent shade, and there is a dignity to shade when it is chosen. Not all the world loves a story that begins in shadow. There were moments when my mother had to move us away from the convent for reasons of discretion, to take up rooms where neighbors would only glance without the hunger for gossip. We moved into a house that smelled of fish and coal, far from the abbey, and built a routine with the small tools of stability: morning coffee, a bowl for soup, an evening where the lamp burned low and the stove kept the room from dropping into cold. In that cycle of leaving shelter and returning to work, my mother stitched a life that was mine, and it was brilliant in its ordinariness. As I grew, there were questions I wanted to ask, and then restrained. Children are curious. We are born with catalogs of questions, but not all questions are safe. So I learned the art of gentle, strategic curiosity. If I wanted to know more about where we had come from, I would bring up neutral topics first. The name of a town, a smell in an old song, the way an unfamiliar garment was hemmed. From that, my mother sometimes released details like small birds, one at a time, tidy and calm. She told me enough to understand that she had once been another person in different rooms with different expectations, and that she had chosen a life of work because it was honest, and because she wanted a child who would not be measured against an absent table. There were days when I envied other children a simple amount of recklessness, the ease with which they let laughter be a thing that could roll and break into shrieks. I envied children who could be forgiven for being careless about the shape of family. But envy is not a path. It is a weather. I tended my own garden of small delights. The first long walk I took alone to the river. The way a song on the radio could make my legs move in a dance without thinking. And all the while, my mother taught me to measure kindness in practical things. A clean shirt, a well-made loaf, the philosophy of a repaired shoe. The convent, the refuge, the birth. These things were the scaffolding of a life that would later feel ordinary, but in truth was an act of considerable bravery. When the community around us discovered bits and pieces of the story, always in whispers or in the cautious half-sentences of old women who like to test the air, my mother faced them with a composure that was not brittle but forged. She never asked for pity. Pity is heavy. It bends the spine. She wanted instead to be seen as a maker of a life. And that is what she remained. A woman who made warmth from a stove and dignity from a basket of mending. There was a particular winter when scarcity pressed close. The coal was thin and the bread scant, and the children in the neighborhood found their cheeks pinched by cold. It was then that the small network that had kept us afloat, the priest who would divert a bag of coal from the parish store, the neighbor who always kept an extra blanket for lending, showed itself to be a web and not merely a string of good intentions. Don Alessio negotiated quietly so as not to call attention. He had a way of doing charity that felt more like engineering than pity. He knew the people who could be asked, and he connected them in ways that made assistance look like business rather than intervention. He taught us that help is gentler when it arrives as a service rather than as a spectacle. It was not only external supports that helped. My mother and I created rituals to keep ourselves afloat. We would set aside one morning each week for luxury, which for us meant a thicker slice of bread, a little bundle of fruit when the season allowed, or a trip to the market where she let me pick a ribbon. These small ceremonies were the grain by which we kept hope from dissolving. She taught me how to make a life out of small reinforcements, how to make a laugh into a limb and a plain day into an island where you could rest. There is a passage in the life of every family when decisions about secrecy and truth need to be made anew. For us, it occurred over and over in different guises, whether to mention a relative's name in a letter, whether to accept an invitation that might bring us near the past, whether to teach a child the name of an absent father, or shield them from the fact that some adults had chosen otherwise. Each choice carried consequences. We weighed them like coins. I remember a time when my eldest, Clara, was small, and asked me plainly why some children had visiting fathers, and others did not. The question landed in the room like a stone in a small pond, and the ripples went far beyond what seemed logical. I could have told her an evasive half-truth. Some people are complicated, but I did not want to teach avoidance where honesty could instruct. Yet I also did not want to breed a curiosity that might become a coil around a heart. So I told her simply that families come in many shapes, and that sometimes the people who make a family do not live in the same house. I spoke of love as action, that which is shown daily at the table, by the hands that mend a sock or fix a chair. That was the language my mother had given me. Love as handwork. It was not romantic. It was practical and almost legal in its accountability. You could measure it by who cooked for you, who came when you cried, who repaired your shoes. That measure was a small court of truth in itself, and it would become the standard by which I judged Vittorio when we passed him in that charity hall years later. The years that followed were not a linear march away from pain, but a weave of moments where dignity was reclaimed in increments. Franco and I built our life deliberately. We taught our children to say please and thank you, to iron a shirt properly before an interview, to respect the kindness of people who might not be immediate family. There was a kind of moral arithmetic at the heart of our household. If you could not provide a nursery rhyme, you could at least provide a breakfast, and that breakfast would count. We found friends who became a chosen kin, people who shared tools, who watched each other's children, who sat at tables and listened. There is a particular quality to the sound of a table when it is full, a kind of layered noise, a music of spoons and laughter, of small grievances that dissolve into jokes. That table became our cathedral. It held not doctrine, but a practice, presence. We filled plates and made way for each other's foibles. My mother, who had once sat in the back of a church as if waiting for permission, sat at our table and raised her voice in jokes and prayers alike. It was as if by allowing noise, she reclaimed her right to be seen. She did not want to be pitied. She wanted to be included. That inclusion felt to her and to me like a small vindication. People often think that confrontation is a river that must be crossed once, a single dramatic moment. For many of us, it is a braided stream with many crossings and shallow fords. The night at the charity was one such ford. After I spoke to Vittorio, I felt not triumph, but a lighter gravity, as if a ledger had been set straight. The reaction in the room was complicated, softening for some, recoiling for others. But what mattered most was the private exchange that followed. My mother at home, laying her hands on my shoulders and saying, in a voice that I heard as both apology and pride, "You have kept what I could not hold." There were days when people would say to me, with the kind of candor only acquaintances afford, "How could you forgive?" Forgiveness is a word that carries too much sermon. What I practiced was mercy and clarity. I did not forgive in the sense of absolving without remembering. I forgave in the sense of arranging my life so it was not governed by a man's absence. I refused to build my home as a monument of wrath. Instead, I built it as a place of consistent gestures, coffee cups on the table, shoes mended when they broke, a hand to hold a child who had scraped a knee. Those gestures were the practical theology of my world. Every family has a crossing that redefines inheritance. For my mother, it was the transition from being measured by losses to being measured by generosity. For me, it was the day I saw my mother's hands steady under the light and realized that what she had built was durable. She had turned scarcity into ritual and shame, into a privacy that bore tenderness instead of bitterness. I saw, too, that the dignity she carved was a language my own children learned by example. They saw that strength could be quiet, and that courage often looked like a woman at the stove making stew. There were small reconciliations along the way. A cousin who had kept a distance began to visit again. A neighbor who had once given the cold shoulder brought a pie at Christmas and sat awkwardly before finding her voice. Not everyone came back. Some doors remained closed, but what mattered was that our house, in its modest way, opened to those willing to enter. The last chapter of that public reckoning was not a legal victory, nor an epic scene. It was a life that refused to be defined by absence. Vittorio continued to be a presence in the town, a man who moved through spaces with the air of entitlement. I do not tell the story to shame him. My narrative is not a public indictment, but to record that accountability does not always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives as the simple act of setting your life in order, of making sure your children know they are worthy. That is a moral weight and also a quiet triumph. As I grew older, I watched my own children take up the habits we had taught them. They learned that a family is more than blood, and that loyalty is demonstrated in the simple, repetitive acts of care. Clara, who liked the piano and sometimes the theater, learned to sew and to forgive a burnt soup. She learned that a table must be readied for guests, whether or not they are equal to your past. That lesson is, in many ways, the beat I wanted to pass along, the idea that generosity is a domestic art. There are images that close a circle. My mother sitting at our table, hands folded, watching the grandchildren chase a ball. My youngest holding a tin photograph and asking slowly with the bluntness of a child, "Who is this?" That question is both a stump and a gift. It allows stories to be told when they are ready, and to be held back when silence is an act of protection. My mother would sometimes look at that photograph and not speak. At other times she would tell me a fragment, an anecdote about a dress, a name of a town where lavender grew wild. She never demanded the past be returned. She simply wanted to ensure the present was full. There is a dignity in ordinary survival that is often overlooked because it is not dramatic enough for the news. The making of a bed, the callus on a thumb, the bowl of soup given to a neighbor. These are the low, honest currencies by which many women like my mother reconstitute a life. She taught me that honor can be built one small, careful act at a time. That is the legacy she left. Not a fortune or a title, but a capacity to create warmth from scarcity. Sometimes when evening comes and the lamp is lit and the house softens into shadow, I think of the 8-year-old who learned to be quiet, and of how that quiet turned into a certain kind of listening. Listening, I discovered, is often a form of resistance. It is refusing to let the noise of other people's judgments drown out your obligations to love. In that silence, I found the tools to make choices, not always the easy ones, but the ones that allowed a child to grow into an adult who could hold another's sorrow without being consumed. I do not believe that our story ended with one confrontation or one speech. Life is a long negotiation. What matters is that we learn to choose what we would carry and what we would lay down. We chose to carry the practice of care. We laid down the idea that the measure of a woman is the curtains she hangs, or the men she married. Instead, we taught our children to measure someone by the hands they extend. In the evenings now, when the grandchildren come and the table becomes loud and bright, I watch my mother with a tenderness that is sharp and sweet. She moves with a grace that has been earned. The lines at the corner of her eyes have stories stitched into them. She can be stubborn and soft, fierce and tender. Once, when a small child refused to eat their peas, she made the same face she had made when she was younger, and said in a voice that still carried the discipline of a woman who had stitched her life from threadbare cloth, "Eat. There are people who would give anything for this plate." It was an admonition wrapped in gratitude. Stories like mine are not unique, but they are not universal either. They are particular. They belong to the small architecture of lives made by choices. What I hope whoever listens to this hears is not a sermon, but an invitation. To see the quiet courage in the people around you, to recognize that a life can be rebuilt in the daily, repetitive acts of care, and that a promise, kept for years and sometimes for a lifetime, can be the foundation of a dignity no scandal can undo. There is a kind of peace to be had when the noise of gossip falls away and the steady rhythm of family life resumes. When I look at my grandchildren running about the garden, their laughter a loose, free thing, I feel the old fracture as something less like a wound and more like a seam that shaped a garment, one you can see but that does not prevent movement. The 8-year-old in me is still there, attentive and cautious. She still recognizes the lamp and the stove, and the way light can be small and generous. But she has learned to live in songs as well as in silence. My mother died slowly, like a winter that gives way to spring without fuss. I was there when she folded her hands for the last time. She looked at me and said simply, "You kept the promise." It was the greatest thing anyone could say to me, not because it absolved the past, but because it acknowledged a life built out of careful mercies. Her funeral was not a spectacle. It was attended by people who had known her as cook, as neighbor, as a woman whose hands taught them to sew a button. There were the nuns who had once sheltered her, Don Alessio, who had the habit of arriving quietly wherever comfort was needed, and our family, noisy and messy and human. When the years press on, memories settle into a kind of furniture. They are moved around and dusted and sometimes sat upon. If you asked me now what I would tell a younger woman who carries a heavy secret, I would not offer a solution that admits to only one path. I would say, choose the kind of courage you can live with. If that courage requires silence for a while, let it be purposeful. If it requires speaking, let it be honest and steady, not mean. Guard your children with the practicality of a woman who knows how to mend, how to cook, how to keep a household warm. There is a final image I like to hold. Our table on a Sunday, the light at its center, the steam rising from plates, my grandchildren chattering, Franco carving the roast with an economy that is almost ceremonial, my mother's hand reaching out to tuck a napkin under a child's chin. The photograph sits on a small shelf nearby, not the one that once caused fear and whispers, but a later picture of a woman with flour on her hands and a smile that is open and true. The town, with all its circuits of rumor and kindness, had made its small adjustments. Not everyone forgave or returned, and some doors remained closed, but the house we made became an answer. I have lived long enough to see patterns repeat and sometimes to alter them. I have learned that the end of one thing, an end of childhood, an end of a secrecy, commonly marks the beginning of another. A life of deliberate care, a family chosen and formed, a legacy of hands that know how to make a shirt and how to make a life. We did not become famous. We did not seek relics. We sought ordinary things, bread, shelter, laughter. In those small things, we found what counts. If this story touches you, if it reminds you of a table where warmth is practiced rather than preached, if it stirs in you the memory of your own quiet teachers, Will you share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity can survive? And if you want more honest testimonies like this one, consider subscribing.